From the University of Nebraska at Omaha, this is Inside Insights. I'm your host, Blake Ursch, in for Aaron Grace. Join us as we discuss today's most pressing issues in terrorism and targeted violence with experts from the field. We are here today with Seamus Hughes. Seamus is our Senior Research Faculty and Policy Associate here at NCITE. And Seamus leads NCITE research that examines non-traditional charges for terrorism suspects, international and domestic. So Seamus has a report coming up about Atomwaffen. But before we get into that, which is a group, a domestic terrorist organization. But before we get into that, Seamus, can you tell us about your project, how you're examining these numbers and or these cases and how you're crunching the numbers on them?
Yeah, so I'm fascinated, absolutely fascinated by cases that involve individuals who've been charged with non-terrorism charges. So what do I mean by that? I mean that if you've got a white supremacist or neo-Nazi or far-right or far-left individual, there is largely not a domestic terrorism statute that you can charge someone with if they commit a terrorist act. They largely charge these individuals with, say, a gun charge or a drug charge or things like that. And the problem when they do that is that from prosecutor's perspective, they get them off the streets, they put them in jail, and they move on. From a public policy perspective, though, it raises a whole host of issues, right? So does that individual get less time than they would if there was a material support to terrorism clause? Yes. Do they end up in a different jail or prison than they would if they got a terrorism charge? Absolutely. Does the probation services, when those individuals get out, do they look for signs of radicalization or ideological motivated materials? No, because what they care about is a gun charge and a drug charge, and they're looking for those type of things. So it has second order effects. It also means that when we try to rack and stack priorities for the national security apparatus, we can have a really good sense of how many guys have been arrested for ISIS-related activities. We don't have that same sense when it comes to domestic terrorism or even international terrorism when it comes to Hamas or Hezbollah, which tends to be charged with money laundering or things like that. And so the point was, my colleagues, Camden, McKenzie, and Brooke and I all got together and said, listen, let's look at this kind of weird delta between, right? So the first project was looking at incel arrests and QAnon arrests and getting a sense of that. And the newest project now is looking at Atomwaffen. And let me just explain a little bit what Atomwaffen is. Atomwaffen was this kind of flash in the pan group that came in 2015, kind of born out of the Iron March online forum there. They largely organized on Discord and Signal. At their height, ProPublica put their numbers at 80 to 100 individuals. And they would basically further the ideology of neo-Nazism, white supremacy, you name it, kind of the usual turn of phrase. They were also hardcore accelerationists, meaning that they would want to further a civil war in the U.S. in order to continue their goals of a white ethno-state or complete societal collapse. And I'm really interested in this case. And I might be jumping ahead for our conversation, but let's have a little back and forth. So what I'm really interested in about this case is when you look at domestic terrorism, you've got like the traditional groups that we all think of like the White Hoods and the KKK and those kind of joining groups. But in recent years, you've seen a movement away from kind of groups and more of this kind of amorphous ideology, meaning that they don't necessarily put the badge on, they don't wear the logo on their shoulder, but they generally believe in kind of white supremacy or neo-Nazism or things like that. But Atomwaffen is a little bit different in that it had a general structure, right? I use the word structure as loosely as possible, but a leadership structure, a command and control-ish type of thing. And so it allows us as researchers to look at this differently, meaning that if I've got an ISIS in America case, I can kind of coalesce that around folks that believe and support ISIS. When I have a domestic terrorism case, I have to coalesce and put that around people that believe in white supremacy in general. And so that becomes hard to compare apples to apples because it's really apples to oranges. Whereas Atomwaffen gives us a chance to look at an actual discrete group that has charges against 21 individuals and say, what do those charges look like and how does that compare to international terrorism prosecutions?
Yeah, no, that's great. And there's so many threads that I want to pull on that that we will. But before we start digging into the specifics of Atomwaffen, I'm curious to know, so where are you getting some of the information that you're using to create your data set? So where is that coming from, and how are you sifting through that data to sort of crunch the numbers on getting the information that you have or that you're able to put out and publish?
So we've got a team of researchers at NCITE who live and breathe this stuff. I guess we should find better hobbies and more fruitful hobbies, but it's, I guess, important for the country. We went through, for this project, we went through 2,700 plus pages of legal documents filed in the federal court system. And that was in dozens of federal courts around the country. And how we started is we looked at Department of Justice press releases where they announced arrests. We then used that to find other cases. So prosecutors tend to specialize in things. So you look at those prosecutors and look at the other cases they may have. We went through and combed through charges of communicating a threat across state lines and whether it was an Atomwaffen connection, child exploitation cases, because there tend to be Atomwaffen individuals in that, and tried to get a sense of the full scope of it. Right. And then we kind of relayed that or kicked those ideas around to a lot of people, both within academia and in government, and said, like, what are we missing? Right. What are the areas that I did? Is there a case I never thought of? Things like that. We're pretty confident we've kind of gotten a general sense of the federal charges against Atomwaffen. And so what we found was 21 individuals have been charged since 2017 with some level of membership with Atomwaffen, and we can dive into what the types of things they were doing, but that's the general scope of it. So, like I said at the beginning, ProPublica put the numbers at 80 to 100 actual members or general members on this. Of that, about 20 or so have been charged with federal crimes.
What kinds of charges did you find?
Yeah, so this is kind of typical for domestic terrorism groups. Most of these individuals were charged with a very interesting statute called communicating a threat across state lines. So well-worn and folks that really like the NCITE podcast will remember that you and I once talked about threats to public officials. And that was a statute they use a lot, communicating threat across state lines. They use that again in Atomwaffen, right? Now, the concern or the issue when you use those type of charges is the sentencing tends to be much less than, say, a material support to terrorism charge. Now, these guys were also charged with illegal firearms, particularly kind of a drug user who tries to purchase a firearm is one of the charges. A good number charged with child exploitation and sexual crimes against children, and then cyber stalking.
I am sort of curious to know, I mean, those of us who follow this, but even just people who are generally aware of sort of the threat landscape in the US, I mean, a lot of times the idea of like a neo-fascist group or neo-Nazi group, I mean, we all just kind of like lump them into this like schema in our heads. And I'm curious to know, like, how did Atomwaffen or does Atomwaffen fit into the sort of broader neo-Nazi landscape? And do the charges that you found, do they reflect kind of the uniqueness of this group within that broader group?
Yeah, I mean, listen, in the relative scope of it all, so the FBI talks about some 2,700 active investigations in all 50 states when it comes to domestic terrorism. If you've got a federal arrest of, say, 20 folks, a relatively small number. But what is kind of interesting about it is, again, this group dynamic, right? So you had a level of organization, news reporting have looked at 25,000 pages of communication between the groups. They produced videos with their own logos on it and all of the things. It had kind of an organizational structure that you wouldn't normally see in this. And it reminded me a lot of the old school domestic terrorism groups. Now, in terms of like what that actually means when it comes to prosecutions, what I was struck by was, how relatively short the sentencing were compared to, say, an ISIS case. So when we look at the data, let me just pull up the document. As I look at the data, the shortest sentence was 12 months and the longest sentence was 216 months. But that 216 months was an outlier, right? Most of these guys got a year or two in jail. And most of them got 36 months of probation when they got out. So if I was an ISIS guy who drove to O'Hare Airport to go join ISIS, I would be looking at 20 years for material support terrorism. Whereas I'm an Atomwaffen guy who threatens to kill a gay or lesbian club owner, that would probably be a 12-month sentence, right? And that individual probably goes into general population and not communication monitoring units at certain prisons that handle terrorism suspects.
So do those shorter sentences though, I mean, those still, based on what I have read from your research, I mean, it sounds like even though these sentences are shorter, it still has an effect on the broader, disrupting the broader group, does
Yeah,
it?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, listen, if you're a prosecutor, you're saying, I don't care what charge I use as long as I get this individual. If I stop the process of violence from occurring, if they commit an illegal act, let's charge them with whatever we have on the books, right? It's the kind of the Al Capone approach to terrorism prosecutions. Um, so it did have an effect, right? So we talked to a lot of analysts and prosecutors as part of this kind of research and just get a sense of things. And the term largely disbanded kept coming up, meaning that the law enforcement efforts were successful in stemming this group. Now, that is different than stemming the movement or the ideology behind it. But less likely to see a bunch of guys with double S's on their back of their logos of their shirts anymore than you would say 5 or 6 years ago. And so it did have an effect when it comes to that. And so we do see if you take out, particularly when you talk about organizations, if you take out a leadership organization or the leaders of an organization, it tends to have an effect on the second, third order effect of it, particularly when you do it and how Department of Justice did it, which was coordinated, meaning that these weren't just like one arrest that happened on a random Tuesday. They were like 5 arrests that happened on a random Tuesday. So there was a level of coordination between 94 different U.S. attorneys' offices and the 56 JTTFs to try to address this in a coordinated fashion.
Can you elaborate on that a bit? Like, what does largely disbanded mean? I mean, we're obviously not talking about them in the past tense. So can you characterize, like, where are they now?
Yeah. So a lot of them are still in jail, although a good number are getting out pretty soon, or if they have already gotten out. When I say largely disbanded, I think, if I look at the cases, we had an uptick in like 2019, 20, 21, and then a slowdown after that. And then you just kind of had a lull. About 3 or 4 months ago, there was a new arrest of an individual who was planning to attack or allegedly planning to attack an energy subset in Tennessee. That individual had some connections with Atomwaffen. It was mentioned throughout the criminal complaint that they did. When I say largely disbanded, I mean that there's not a command and control structure, or there does not appear to be a command and control structure like there used to be in the past, but you still have former members who are still adherents to the ideology. They learned what they could from the past, and they try to use that in order to advance their violent goals.
Do we know like where those remaining members are active, like what platforms or where they're sort of discussing things?
Yeah, I mean, most of the domestic terrorism groups are going to be focusing, or organizations are going to be focused on Discord, Signal, and the occasional Telegram. Um, Forums are important, but not the be all end all that it used to be on it. And so it is in the corners and the sad parts of the internet that are encrypted and allow for a level of connection. They're looking for the lonely and disenfranchised young men and trying to recruit.
How much of this case, I'm just curious to know, like how much of what has happened with these prosecutions and what has happened to Atomwaffen, how much is this group an outlier? So have we seen similar cases with other violent or similar instances with other violent extremist ideologies that have been disrupted in this way?
Yeah, I think I don't want to give too many tips to domestic terrorists, but I would say that the more organized you become, the more likely you are to be arrested and taken down. I think law enforcement intuitively knows how to build a corkboard with a leadership structure and yarns that connect to everybody and say, let's take down these 10 guys at the same time, right? And so when you sign up for a actual group, that puts a target on your back in a way that it wouldn't if you were a lone actor or a lone offender in these type of things. So what we do see is every couple of years or so, we have a group like Atomwaffen or the Base or Islamic Thinker Society or Revolution Muslim or things like that will pop up, become a flash in the pan, get a lot of media coverage, and prosecutors and law enforcement will take notice and then take action from there.
How you bring up a really good point, which I know that your research has touched on this, and I'm wondering how much you can speak to it. But how have prosecutors approached disrupting some of these more amorphous groups that aren't as organized as, say, Atomwaffen is?
Yeah, I mean, largely it's going to be kind of whatever's on the shelf for that day. What you do see when you talk to prosecutors in the FBI around the country, they'll say the flash to bang between radicalization to mobilization to violence. So, like when somebody holds extremist beliefs to when they actually act on those extremist beliefs is getting shorter. And so, particularly for domestic terrorism groups or domestic terrorism extremists, you see uh, law enforcement using whatever's on the shelf when it comes to charges. They're not building complex cases to bring to a grand jury. They're bringing a child exploitation case that they can prove immediately because they have the data right there. And so they're not waiting for things to bubble up or format, or they're also not waiting to see if they have new friends, meaning that in old school traditional counterterrorism investigations, you'd let it play out a little bit, right? So you'd say, okay, does this guy have five other buddies that he goes and meets with every Tuesday, and let's see who those five guys are, and let's build out a wiretap on that. You're not necessarily seeing that at any real clip anymore. What you're seeing is a lean in on prosecutions pretty quickly.
Are there, I guess this is sort of just an anecdotal question about the broad threat landscape that we're living in, which, as we know, the red lights are blinking. Um, People are worried. But would you say that we are seeing like a shift to this more like amorphous structure? Or I guess my question is like, how do you see the domestic extremism landscape evolving over the course of, say, the next decade?
Yeah, I mean, I see the threat landscape in the U.S. being the same it has been for the last 2 years, which is complex, confusing, convoluted, all of the words you can think of to describe it. So, in the old school days of say 10 years ago, the FBI could devote 90% of the resources to a group like ISIS because it controlled territory the size of the UK and it was recruiting hundreds of people from America. What you're seeing now is that local law enforcement and the FBI have to be jack of all trades, meaning they have to be able to understand international terrorism, Hamas, Al Qaeda, ISIS, but also understand Chads and Stacy for incels and what a Q drop means for QAnon and what accelerationism means for Atomwaffen. And that becomes really, really complicated very quickly, right? I think of the folks at NCITE, right, which is there. We all specialize in certain ideological bents, right? I know ISIS like the back of my hand. Unfortunately, so right. I can understand when I see Anwar Awlaki that I should be concerned about the individual, right? But what you're seeing now is as younger researchers get in the field is they have to be steeped in everything, right? They have to kind of know at least a little bit of everything so they can spot things, all right? We're also seeing a morphing or shifting of ideologies, meaning that someone can be a QAnon guy who's also an incel, who's also a white supremacist, right? So the need to be able to cross all of those ideological landscapes, although they seem like they're being countered in your head, they don't seem like they should make sense in a box. They actually do for a lot of these guys.
Great. Um, I don't know, we're coming up a little bit on time here, but my question for you, what do you want people to know mostly about your research and if you had to leave people with one message about the work you're doing here, what would it be?
Yeah, I'm really interested in how we focus our resources, right? So, if we're bringing non-terrorism charges against terrorism suspects, does that mean that the public doesn't have a full understanding or full accounting of the nature of the threat? Are we missing things? Does it get swept away on that? So, why I'm really excited about doing this research for NCITE is that we can shed a light a little bit on some of this stuff, right? There are very few places in this country that do counterterrorism research like we do. Very few places in the country that are still around to do counterterrorism research like we do. And so I'm really hopeful to get a lot of this information out of the public so they can make an informed decision on what they want to do, right? Do they want to call their congressman or not, right? Do they get a sense of what the threat looks like? Should they be scared? Should they be not? All of those things, right? And so the goal of NCITE, I think, is to provide that research to policymakers and practitioners, but also to provide it to the public so they can get a nonpartisan kind of trusted approach to understanding what's happening when it comes to the terrorism landscape in the U.S.
Right on. Well, thank you so much, Seamus. We will have a link to this report that we've discussed about Atomwaffen coming out, along with some of these other things that we've talked about today, up on our website. Stay tuned for more expert analysis from Seamus and our other very smart people here at the center. And we will see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
This series is produced by Ben Batafarano, Aaron Grace, Scott Jordan, and Blake Ursch. Thank you for joining us on another episode of NCITE Insights. NCITE is an academic center of excellence for the Department of Homeland Security. Looking for more info? Check out our website at incite.unomaha.edu or email us at incite@unomaha.edu.